Have you ever thought about the feeling of living two completely different realities? One where everything seems safe and controlled, and the other where an overwhelming passion consumes you, making you forget everything that once seemed important? This is the true face of forbidden betrayal. Many would say that guilt, pain, and regret are inevitable, but do we truly understand the cost of a decision that, at first, seems like just a temporary escape? The truth is that, often, we get involved in stories of infidelity without even realizing the emotional whirlwind we're creating for ourselves. No matter how much we try to justify or rationalize what's happening, a betrayal changes everything. In this video, you'll understand the true dimension of what happens when we make impulsive decisions, when we let ourselves be swept away by passion and desire without thinking about the consequences. And more importantly, we'll reflect on what you would do if you were in the shoes of someone who made these decisions. Have you subscribed to the channel yet? Then, like the video, share it with someone who also needs to understand what's truly at stake when we talk about forbidden betrayal, and turn on the notifications so you don't miss the next content. The narrator was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, when Pedro entered the room, with a step that seemed to carry an invisible weight. As he passed by her, an accidental touch, light but full of energy, made both of them freeze for a second. Right there, amidst the aroma of coffee and the soft sounds of the house in the morning, something seemed to have changed in the air. The tension that grew in that moment wasn't visible, but it was present in every furtive glance exchanged, in every movement that seemed more loaded than usual. A spark, though small, had been lit, and the feeling of discomfort hung in the air, creating a space where there had once only been familiarity. The interaction was quick, almost unnoticed, but the impact of that touch was unmistakable. The narrator quickly stepped away, but not before realizing that her proximity to Pedro felt different. She knew that something had shifted in their dynamic, and a small discomfort overtook her. It wasn't just the physical closeness. There was something else, something that couldn't easily be named, that was there. This moment seemed insignificant, but it was already shaping what was to come. A small incident, but, as we'll see, it would serve as a prelude to something much more intense and complicated. As the coffee continued to boil, the narrator forced herself to go on with her routine, trying to push thoughts of Pedro aside. But his image, his touch, and that energy in the air kept coming back. The tension wasn't between them anymore, but inside her. A growing desire to understand what had happened, to explore this connection, was beginning to form, and with it, the weight of guilt that was already present. What seemed like just an ordinary morning was about to give rise to something much more complex. Something that, unknowingly, was about to collapse her routine and her idea of stability. Over time, Pedro moved in with them. The narrator, at first, thought that the forced coexistence would be temporary, but soon realized that daily proximity wasn't easing the tension. It was, on the contrary, making it worse. Between meals, conversations about trivial matters, and furtive glances, she began to notice that, as time passed, something more was being shared between them. It was as if Pedro had become more than just her husband's son. He was becoming a reflection of something the narrator was starting to fear admit, a growing desire. With every conversation, the narrator found herself more intrigued. They shared similar interests, hobbies the narrator never imagined she'd share with someone so young, and a way of seeing the world that seemed to align more and more. It wasn't just the coexistence itself, but the connection that was forming. Pedro didn't pull away, and neither did she. She was starting to understand that the lines between natural coexistence and something more were becoming blurred, and that left her divided. Like a rope stretched too far, she knew that at some point it would snap. Despite the growing attraction, she tried to fight against the feelings taking over her. At night, she would wonder if this was just a phase or if something more was at play. What to do when desire infiltrates daily coexistence, and you find yourself unable to resist such a forbidden attraction. The discomfort of the situation made her question her own limits and what she was willing to risk. The tension only grew, and the situation became harder to control with each passing day. Over time, the accidental touches between the narrator and Pedro became more frequent. Every bump, every proximity seemed to carry an electric charge, a silent signal that they both seemed to understand, but no one dared to mention. The narrative of everyday life began to mix with moments of tension, where every gesture felt more loaded than the last. And in the meantime, the messages exchanged between them, seemingly innocent at first, began to become more suggestive. They weren't just words, they were disguised communication, something both had already recognized as more than mere coincidence. The narrator, increasingly involved in this silent game, tried to control her feelings, but the internal struggle was immense. How could she explain this growing attraction? The guilt, stronger with each passing moment, became a constant shadow, but she couldn't push the thoughts of Pedro away. The excitement was there, present in every furtive glance and every involuntary touch. The feeling of betrayal, however, was also growing, and the narrator found herself increasingly divided between what she desired and what she knew was right. Her marriage to João was becoming an increasingly unstable ground, but her passion for Pedro was overwhelming. The temptation became irresistible, and a distant weekend was the catalyst for what seemed inevitable. The narrator, now completely consumed by attraction, made a decision that would change everything. She knew that what was about to happen in a motel was a point of no return, but still, she couldn't resist. It wasn't just the pursuit of pleasure, it was the need to confirm that this connection, however forbidden, was real. The desire became stronger than reason, and the path she was choosing was the most dangerous, but also the most exciting. The affair with Pedro began to take a more serious turn when he gave the narrator an ultimatum. Either she left João, or their secret relationship would continue. This moment was a turning point. Until then, everything had seemed like a game, a fantasy. But now, what was at stake wasn't just fleeting pleasure. It was the choice between a stable marriage and an overwhelming passion for Pedro. The tension was palpable, and the decision seemed harder than ever. How could she, after all, leave everything behind? And what if that meant destroying what was left of her organized and secure life? The narrator, overwhelmed with doubt, felt the weight of each choice. The security João offered, with whom she shared a history, a home, and a life built over the years, was in direct contrast to the fever and desire Pedro stirred in her. It wasn't just about attraction, but something deeper and more intense, something that seemed to fill a void her marriage with João no longer did. The dilemma intensified, but the narrator knew that the decision couldn't be delayed forever. The idea of living a lie began to eat away at her, and the weight of her inevitable choice was already beginning to mark every moment of her routine. This decision wouldn't be easy, and she knew it. The fear of change, of the end of a life that had seemed secure until then, mixed with the fear of letting go of something as deep as her attraction to Pedro. The doubt about what to do never left her, but she also knew that by postponing the choice, she was only prolonging the suffering. It was as if the consequences had already begun to take shape, waiting to be faced. Meanwhile, the secret encounters between her and Pedro grew more intense, and the tension was about to explode. As the affair with Pedro deepened, the narrator's guilt became more unbearable. The passion she felt for him was so intense that she could no longer distinguish between desire and guilt. Every moment with Pedro felt like an escape, but at the same time, every moment apart from him brought immense pressure. Her marriage to João, which once seemed like her foundation of security, now served as a constant reminder of the infidelity. The internal struggle became an endless cycle, and every day, the narrator found herself more divided. How could she reconcile stable love with João and the overwhelming passion for Pedro? Guilt was not just an invisible shadow, but a constant presence that took over her mind. The pleasure with Pedro, as great as it was, couldn't silence the weight of the consequences. What was at stake wasn't just her relationship with João, but also the narrator's very identity. She wondered, who is she now? An unfaithful woman? A traitorous wife? Every thought consumed her more, but at the same time, the attraction to Pedro kept her blind to the consequences. It was as if she were living in two parallel worlds, one where everything was perfect, but at a price, and the other where passion dragged her into the abyss. But despite the emotional confusion, the narrator knew that nothing would be solved with one more day of escape. The truth she already knew was becoming impossible to ignore. Either she made a decision, or the choices of the past would destroy her from the inside out. The doubt between marriage and passion was turning into unbearable pressure. The path seemed to be narrowing, and, at some point, she would have to face the reality of her actions and their consequences. But until then, she continued to sink deeper into this emotional labyrinth. The affair with Pedro finally reached a point of no return. In a final meeting, they secretly came together, fully aware that what was about to happen couldn't be undone. The narrative of their lives up until that point was swallowed by the intensity of the desire and the connection they shared. The passion was in the air, palpable, in every touch, every sigh, and the guilt, though still present, seemed a distant shadow in comparison to what they felt. Driving to the motel was now a one-way trip, a conscious choice not to turn back, despite the consequences they knew were irreversible. Every moment they spent together seemed like a reflection of everything they had lived until then. The tension, the attraction, the fear of getting caught, all mixing into a cocktail of emotions and sensations. For the narrator, there were no more doubts, only a painful certainty that, no matter how much she tried to deny it, what she felt for Pedro was far greater than anything she could have with João. And despite the anguish and guilt, the force of desire seemed to be the only thing guiding her. The love she felt for João, the security, seemed like an illusion next to the fire that Pedro ignited within her. The moment they arrived at the motel, the line between right and wrong was completely blurred. What had once been a secret adventure was now a concrete reality. They were no longer just seeking pleasure, but confirming something that had been there from the start. With each step they took together, they sank deeper into the abyss they had created. And at the same time, there was a sense of relief. Finally, the path was set, and nothing would ever be the same after that moment. After all the weight of the choices made, the narrator found herself immersed in an even more difficult internal struggle. The encounter with Pedro, which had seemed like a pursuit of pleasure and relief, became a mix of euphoria and guilt that consumed her. The passion was undeniable, The attraction between them had surpassed any limits of reason. But as the relationship deepened, the guilt became more and more unbearable. The feeling of betraying Joao was no longer just a distant thought, but a present pain that marked every moment with Pedro. The excitement the narrator felt with Pedro was like a flame that, though intense, began to burn destructively. She knew that what they were doing wasn't just wrong in Joao's eyes, but that the consequences of their actions would reverberate in her life in ways she couldn't yet fully understand. The relationship with Pedro, however, continued to consume everything, overshadowing what once seemed like a solid relationship with Joao. It was as if passion had a captivating power, making her forget, for brief moments, the cost of her choices. This emotional roller coaster was not something the narrator could ignore for much longer. While the pleasure with Pedro was indescribable, she knew that this pleasure was tainted by guilt. The dilemma between passion and responsibility, between desire and consequences, grew heavier. What had once seemed like a simple secret adventure was now being lived with increasing emotional weight, and the narrator found herself at the mercy of a whirlwind of contradictory feelings. With each encounter, the distance between her and Joao grew, and the temptation to continue with Pedro became a need she couldn't deny. The struggle between stable love for Joao and overwhelming passion for Pedro had never been so intense. The narrator now found herself at an emotional crisis point. Spending a weekend with Pedro was the opportunity to experience, uninterrupted, what she truly felt. But deep down, she knew that this pleasure and excitement were being paid for at a very high price. Guilt not only accompanied her, but ate away at her. She knew she was disrespecting something deep and meaningful in her marriage, but at the same time, she couldn't disconnect from Pedro. With each passing day, the narrator felt more divided. How could she continue with Joao, her husband, with whom she had shared so many moments, while at the same time maintaining such an intense and destructive relationship with Pedro? The emotion of being with Pedro blended with the remorse of deceiving Joao, but paradoxically, this emotion also made her feel alive in a way she no longer experienced in her marriage. The line between love and betrayal was fading. For the narrator, what seemed like a fleeting passion was becoming a need, something she could no longer control, but also couldn't abandon. It was as if every choice led her to a point where there was no turning back. The weekend with Pedro brought out feelings she didn't want to admit, feelings that had been buried beneath the surface for a long time. She knew that every day spent with Pedro pulled her further from Joao, and while part of her wished to continue the lie, another part knew she couldn't stay in a state of denial much longer. Guilt became an ever heavier burden, but the need for Pedro seemed stronger. The narrator's double life became unsustainable. The pressure of maintaining the relationship with Joao while hiding the intensity of the affair with Pedro grew every day. The narrator found herself constantly on a knife's edge, trying to balance two worlds that, deep down, couldn't coexist much longer. The attraction to Pedro was no longer a matter of desire, but of need. But what she didn't realize was how much this need was destroying her ability to make rational decisions. The tension between the two worlds was becoming unbearable, and the narrator knew something would have to give. Pedro, for his part, was no longer willing to live in the shadow of the narrator's marriage. He wanted more, and he was determined to make her decide. "Choose," he said firmly and irrevocably. "Either Joao or me." The narrator found herself facing an ultimatum that couldn't be ignored. On one hand, life with Joao, with its certainties and stability. On the other, the overwhelming passion and desire for Pedro, which consumed her in a way she had never experienced. The decision was difficult, but somehow it was already being made, without her realizing it. The tension between the two grew, and each choice seemed even more impossible to make. But no matter how divided she felt, something inside her told her that the time to decide was running out. The double life, which for so long had seemed like a secret and exciting adventure, was now pressuring her in a way she didn't know how to handle. Guilt, fear, and excitement were mixing into an emotional storm that was overwhelming her. And deep down, she knew this storm wouldn't stop until she made a decision. But at what cost? Pedro finally pressured the narrator to make her choice, and the situation became more urgent than ever. The ultimatum was clear. Either she stayed with João, her husband, or chose Pedro, the passion that had ignited her life in a way that could not be ignored. The narrator knew this decision was the breaking point, but as intense as her attraction to Pedro was, something inside her told her that there was something bigger at stake. João was not just her husband. He was the foundation of her life. But at the same time, Pedro represented everything she had lost of herself: the excitement, the desire, and the freedom. The choice was not simple. As someone who had been in a marriage for so long, the narrator found herself trapped in the idea that security and stability should be the pillars of her life. But what to do when the passion for Pedro seemed to fill a void she didn't know existed? The internal struggle was overwhelming, and even knowing that choosing João would mean deep and possibly irreversible pain, she gave in. The decision, though difficult, was made, and João was the final choice. However, in doing so, the narrator couldn't help but feel a wave of regret and the sense that something inside her had been lost forever. Pedro, in turn, did not take the decision well. The passion he felt for the narrator was too strong, and João's choice seemed, to him, an even greater betrayal. The tension that had built up throughout the entire relationship now turned into frustration and anger. The narrator, now free from Pedro's pressure, faced the reality of what she had done. Although she had chosen João, the emotional weight of the decision was immense. The guilt of moving away from Pedro and the regret of not following her feelings made life even harder. Now, what remained were the consequences of a forbidden affair that had dissolved, but whose traces would remain. The breaking point came in a dramatic and unpredictable way. João, the narrator's husband, finally discovered the truth. The shock was immense. Catching them in the act, the reality of the betrayal took on a proportion the narrator never imagined she would face. That moment was like a blow that destroyed everything she believed to be safe. The betrayal was no longer just a matter of personal choices, but a cruel reality that was difficult to confront. The pain of seeing João so deeply hurt was something she couldn't erase, even if she wanted to. This moment of revelation, however, didn't bring relief. On the contrary, it made the narrator feel even more lost. Now, she not only had to deal with the betrayal of Pedro, but with the pain of seeing João, whom she loved so much, destroyed by the same lie. The truth was there, raw and naked, and the consequences were beyond her control. What had once seemed like a decision between two paths now became a choice that would torment her forever. Pedro, the lover, was no longer an option, but a bitter reminder of what could have been, while João, her husband, seemed to be the only possibility for recovery. The narrator found herself at an emotional abyss. The betrayal, which had once been a secret adventure, was now an irreparable reality. There was no turning back. Joel's shock, anger, and pain blended with the narrator's regret and guilt. The breaking point had arrived, and with it, the end of something that seemed impossible to end. The affair with Pedro was over, but the consequences of the choices made were far from over. Now, the narrator would have to deal with the scars of a mistake that changed her life forever. After all the pain, guilt, and regret, the narrator finally found herself alone with her thoughts, reflecting on everything that had happened. The passion, which once seemed to be the solution to everything, now seemed like a distant and empty shadow. What she initially saw as a simple escape, a hidden adventure, had turned into an indelible mark on her life. The memories of Pedro, though intense, were no longer a source of pleasure. They represented the pain of a choice that could not be undone. And, although the affair had ended, the consequences would remain forever. That feeling of having lost something important, something that would never be recovered, became a constant. The betrayal had not only destroyed her marriage, but also the trust she had in herself. What seemed like a quest for excitement and desire turned into a bitter lesson about the limits of passion and the prices paid for ignoring them. The realization that it had all been for nothing, that she had exchanged stability for a moment of fleeting pleasure, began to consume every part of her soul. Now, the narrator understands that passion is not the only fuel that keeps a relationship alive. True love, commitment, and trust are far more valuable than any momentary thrill. However, this lesson came too late. What remained for her were the remnants of a forbidden affair, the pain of a choice made, and the certainty that passion, when not guided by reason, can be the greatest enemy of true happiness. The price of her actions was high, and the only thing she could do now was live with the consequences, carrying with her a difficult but necessary realization. We have now reached the point where a decision needs to be made. What would you do if you were in the narrator's place? Would you stay in a comfortable marriage or give in to forbidden passion and desire? The key here is to realize that the choices we make can have a profound and lasting impact, both on our lives and on those we love. And by understanding the consequences of betrayal, we can learn to deal with our own feelings and reactions in a more conscious and balanced way. Now, think carefully about your decisions, for life is made of choices. Are you ready to take the reins of your destiny and follow the path that truly aligns with your values and happiness? Temptation may be great, but remember, true strength lies in resisting momentary impulses and making decisions based on what is best for your future. Reflection is the first step to transforming your life. If you want to continue learning more about how to make more conscious decisions and understand the consequences of every action, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep following our content. Let's walk together on this journey of self-knowledge and growth.